versus the series they produced for television.
Right. And by the way, if you're just tuning in, listeners, I'm talking with Dr. Jared Bahir Browse, author of the new book, Hanna-Barbera, A History. It's on McFarland Press. Now, let's get into the whole issue of diversity in their cartoons and all, because I guess, it starts off with the Tom and Jerry cartoons and the depiction of a black character, and actually it's the maid. And talk about that because it's something that they do later on when they come to television with those cartoons. They do something different that really confused me when I was little, but now I know what it's all about.
Yeah, and the character that, and you only see her twice, but Mammy Two Shoes, and again that name
Yeah.
is just, it wasn't even kind of it's similar to Disney and Dumbo, the Crow character being named Jim Crow, that they weren't
Right.
even pretending or even trying to block the stereotypes there, and you only see her legs. And the legs have a darker skin tone, and obviously the idea, and they kind of go back and forth on that, partly because of pressure from organizations like the NAACP, is that is she the housekeeper? Is she the owner of the house, with Tom being her cat, and then the battling between Tom and Jerry? And then when they moved to television, because of the criticism over the character, all of a sudden she became Irish.
Right.
And so a lot of children grew up with that character, that maid character, that character that people were kind of trying to determine what her kind of relationship was. She was whitewashed. And now kind of going back to where you can buy it, there'll be a warning, but they went back to the original character, but they did shift that to kind of to try to block off any criticism, because, and also the other issue was that it was being replayed over and over again
Right.
versus in theaters where it would be kind of one off and then people would leave. And so to avoid that, they moved over, and there, I mean, there's still issues with and I was just watching the Flintstones before this, and still issues with Irish characterization and things like that, but not nearly as damaging and long lasting and as ubiquitous as the stereotyping of Black women at the time.
Right. And by the way, that was voiced by Hattie McDaniels at the time.
Yeah.
And the other thing that, I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the 60s watching these cartoons as a kid. They would do the Irish voice, but then they would do something else. That sometimes the shows that were showing these cartoons, the Tom and Jerry cartoons, they would just not have any voice on. So you would see Tom looking up at this character and nothing, you would hear nothing. And you would see lines coming out of his head, or he's sweating, but you don't know what's going on. So it's very, it was very confusing for me to see, 1 minute she's got an Irish voice, the next minute she doesn't have any voice. But something's obviously going on there. But that,
Yeah, and
mm-hmm.
I just want to go back that that Mammy Two Shoes was actually voiced by Lillian Randolph.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. That's right.
Oh no, it's no problem, because, but again, all their voices, it was based on Hattie McDaniel, and
Right.
so it was like Alan Reed doing Jackie Gleason. That was very similar, and I mean Lillian Randolph, kind of going back to racist shows, she was actually on Amos and Andy.
Right.
And so you still have that connection, but it's in, I mean, one kind of, it's interesting. I mean, Tom and Jerry, to have an entire film series, and we see this later with the Roadrunner films and TV shows, to have an entire series where the main characters don't talk at all is amazing. And then they try to utilize that to kind of, again, to whitewash or completely just ignore that past history of the voicing of Mammy Two Shoes. And so it's interesting, and especially for those who grew up with these films, you'll notice those blank spots or notice those changes again for them to avoid the criticism they're receiving, especially the criticism really ramped up, like with a lot of institutions in the United States after World War II, when you had the Pittsburgh Courier Double V campaign, and then kind of the push with Jackie Robinson and others, that these cultural institutions saying, well, we served to fight racism in Europe, maybe we should pay attention to that in the United States. And we're still fighting that fight. But due to that pressure, again, you see those shifts and you see that editing to, instead of actually admitting a mistake, just trying to ignore it and move on. And they did that with a lot of their cartoons. And Warner and Disney did the same thing as well.
Right, they certainly did. Now let's move on to once they get on Hanna-Barbera and gets their stuff on television on a regular basis in the late 50s and 60s and onward. Talk about their first dark-skinned character. Because yeah, go ahead.
So it's, I mean, and you look back and the really looking at all these films up until the late 60s, early 70s, you had the only, I mean, in the Flintstones, there was only some background characters that had slightly darker skin. And I point out some of the episodes. One is when they had kind of the version of the Boy Scouts in Bedrock. They had a jamboree and they all came and they had from different countries, but even they had a delegation. First of all, they were identifying by country, and it's like, well, if this is prehistory, there are no countries. And then the delegation from Mexico was slightly darker skinned, but they looked like all the other characters. But they finally got pushed to feature. Well, they had some Middle Eastern and Southeast Asian characters in Jonny Quest in particular, but the first time they had starring characters that were non-white, particularly African American, were with Harlem Globetrotters, and they were never going to create their own non-white characters. That was never, and almost all of their cartoons were based on a franchise or based on a celebrity, and so that wasn't unusual. But they wanted an established, they wanted to establish property to move forward, and so they had, and they debuted in the same day. You had Harlem Globetrotters featuring the famous basketball team, and honestly, that was one of my favorite shows growing up. And then you had Josie and the Pussycats featuring Valerie, the first African-American female starring character on Saturday morning. And so this one year, they decided to kind of make that jump, and then they just stopped. And there was a second Harlem Globetrotters that was more of a superhero show that came on a little later. But ultimately, they kind of this one season, right around that peak of the civil rights movement, they decided to start producing these shows, and they made a deal with the Harlem Globetrotters to feature them in a cartoon, and then they figured that must be enough, and these shows were going to rerun for a while, and they never really went back to featuring, and they moved more toward or kind of stayed in their lane when it came to funny animal characters. And then especially with the year before, you had Scooby-Doo debuted, and they really put a lot of weight behind that franchise because it was so popular. And
they kept doing that same bit. They had all these other dogs eventually. We would do the same thing. A dog with a cast of 3, teenagers and young people in a mystery show. There were a whole bunch of those that they had.
Yeah. And I mean, Josie and the Pussycats was a mystery show.
That's right.
And so, and so they never liked reinventing the wheel. Once they found something that worked, they bled it dry, and they
Yeah.
were and not only bled it dry in terms of kind of storylines and things like that, but also in terms of merchandising. There were really, I mean, Disney was very calculated with the way they merchandise their films, whereas Hanna-Barbera, and that was part of their influence and why they were so popular with children. Everything, it didn't matter the quality, it didn't matter um, what the product was, as long as it was child friendly. But anything that they could put Scooby Doo's face on, they could put Fred Flintstone's or Yogi Bear's face. They did. I mean, we still have Yogi Bear representing a chain of RV parks
Right.
and things like. And so that they were, again, they were shameless, but that Scooby Doo model really kept on. One, the amount of iterations of Scooby Doo series is remarkable when you actually look at it. And actually, I'm working on a new project looking at all the reboots they did,
Oh
because
my
we're in this
goodness.
era of reboots, and they were
Right.
really kind of the first ones to really take advantage of that. But even outside of Scooby Doo, they just kept coming back to this mystery, a bunch of teenagers solving mysteries type of framework, and then just kind of mixing and matching the characters within that framework.
And there's one show that they did, as I was doing research for the book again, I had forgotten all about this show. And it was one of the like serials more or less that was on another show. And I'm talking about the Banana Splits, but they had a show on there called Danger Island. And I could not believe how they got away with that. The characters, as far as the quote natives, and this was like 69, 70, and the stereotypes in this thing is just blatantly bad. I mean, it's awful.
And I mean, it's like, and originally, again, they kind of that whole kind of interaction with quote unquote natives is something that it was supposed to be a live action Johnny Quest originally. And then, but they kind of went that even further. You have the character Chango. They're interacting with cannibal natives,
Right.
and constantly the headhunters, and so that was that the presence of those cannibals was much, whereas Johnny Quest would have a different kind of villain each episode. They kept coming back to this, and so that and some of the ability to get away from that was the fact that it was part of that kind of the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. So it wasn't the primary show, but it was still seen over and over. And it was Richard Donner actually directed it.
Oh,
And
I didn't
so,
know
and
that.
he's famous.
Wow.
Yeah. And so and he went on to Superman and the Goonies and Lethal Weapon and all of those films. But that, yeah, the fact that they kind of relied on this stereotype of anyone who is kind of in an isolated or a less technologically advanced civilization are automatically cannibal natives, and kind of that interaction just facilitated that stereotype over and over again.
I mean, it's just like the old King Kong, 1930s King Kong. Same thing with the so-called natives, the cannibals. They are chasing after him. I think there's a young little white girl on there, little blonde girl, and they're chasing her.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. But I want to ask you too about someone we mentioned off air that I never realized this, but this. Do you think Hanna Barbera was purposely doing this, or was it something that was caught many years later? I'm talking about the character Snagglepuss, and talk about him.
So, and they've had and I'll come back because they've had a few characters where this is brought up, but you have a character like Snagglepuss where um it's he presents as gay or as queer, and so, and it's very kind of the campy approach, um And so and they came upon this later with Velma as well,
Right.
kind of questions about sexuality and things like that.